Hook. In the gilded halls of power, where centuries-old traditions clash with modern expectations, one moment of uncontrolled rage would expose the darkest secrets of the Ashworth royal family and threaten to bring down a 1,000-year monarchy. What started as a simple security protocol would spiral into a constitutional crisis that would force a nation to question everything they believed about their beloved royals. The autumn morning mist hung thick over the manicured lawns of Ashworth Palace as Queen Isabella Ashworth reviewed the day's schedule with her private secretary. The 68-year-old monarch, whose reign had spanned 4 decades, prided herself on maintaining the delicate balance between tradition and progress that had kept the Kingdom of Valdoria stable through countless political storms. Her silver hair was perfectly arranged beneath a simple pearl tiara, and her navy blue suit bore the subtle elegance that had become her trademark. Yet, beneath her composed exterior, Isabella carried the weight of recent family tensions that threatened to overshadow her legacy. The source of her greatest concern stood just 3 floors above her in the east wing of the palace. Prince Adrian Ashworth, 28 years old and third in line to the throne, had become increasingly difficult to manage. Once the darling of the press with his charitable work and easy charm, Adrian had spent the last 2 years spiraling into what palace insiders whispered was a dangerous combination of entitlement and rage. His marriage to Lady Catherine Pemberton had been meant to stabilize him, providing the grounding influence that his mother hoped would mature her youngest son. Instead, it seemed to have amplified his worst impulses. Catherine, now Princess Catherine, had discovered the true nature of her husband's temperament only after their lavish wedding at Westminster Cathedral. Behind closed doors, Adrian revealed himself to be controlling, prone to violent outbursts, and utterly convinced of his divine right to have his every whim satisfied immediately. The palace staff had learned to walk on eggshells around him, and several longtime employees had quietly requested transfers to other royal households rather than continue serving under his unpredictable moods. On this particular morning, Adrian had woken in a foul temper after reading headlines about his older brother Prince Edward's successful trade mission to Southeast Asia. The articles praised Edward's diplomatic skills and suggested he was becoming the crown's most valuable asset in international relations. And for Adrian, who had always felt overshadowed by his accomplished older siblings, these reports were like salt in an open wound. He had spent his breakfast throwing newspapers across his private dining room, while Catherine watched in worried silence. The tension in the palace was palpable as staff members went about their morning duties. Head of Security Commander James Morrison had briefed his team on what he termed a yellow alert day, meaning they should be prepared for potential incidents involving Adrian. Morrison, a former military officer with 20 years of experience protecting the royal family, had developed an almost supernatural ability to sense when trouble was brewing in the palace corridors. The catalyst for the day's events began with something seemingly insignificant. Adrian had decided he wanted to visit the palace's private gardens to clear his head, but protocol required that he be accompanied by a security detail whenever he left the main palace building. This was a long-standing rule that had been in place since a security breach 5 years earlier, when an intruder had managed to scale the garden walls and get within 50 feet of the royal family's private residence. Guard Thomas Whitmore, a dedicated officer with 8 years of service to the crown, was assigned to accompany the prince. Whitmore, 34 years old and the father of 2 young children, took his duties seriously and had never had a negative incident with any member of the royal family. He was known among his colleagues for his professionalism and his ability to blend into the background, allowing the royals their privacy while maintaining the necessary security protocols. When Adrian emerged from the palace's main entrance, he was already agitated. His jaw was clenched, his hands were balled into fists, and his usually perfectly styled brown hair was disheveled from running his fingers through it. He had changed from his breakfast attire into dark jeans and a black sweater, clothes that reflected his brooding mood. As he walked briskly toward the garden gates, Whitmore fell into step behind him at the prescribed distance of 6 feet. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and the distant sound of London traffic beyond the palace walls. Under normal circumstances, Adrian might have found the walk soothing. The gardens were his favorite part of the palace grounds, with their carefully maintained rose beds, ancient oak trees, and winding gravel paths that had been walked by generations of his ancestors. Today, however, even the beauty of his surroundings seemed to irritate him. As they reached the entrance to the private rose garden, Adrian suddenly stopped and turned to face Whitmore. His blue eyes, so often described by admirers as charming and warm, now burned with cold fury. "I don't need you following me around like a lost dog," he snapped, his voice carrying the crisp accent that marked him as a product of the finest private schools. I'm going for a walk in my own garden, not leading a military parade. Whitmore maintained his professional composure, as he had been trained to do. I understand your frustration, Your Highness, he replied calmly. But security protocols require that I accompany you outside the main building. I'll keep my distance and ensure your privacy as much as possible. The guard's reasonable tone seemed to inflame Adrian's anger rather than calm it. In his current state, any reminder of rules or limitations felt like a personal attack on his authority. He had spent his entire life being told what he could and couldn't do, where he could and couldn't go, and today he had reached his breaking point. Did I ask for your understanding? Adrian shot back, his voice rising. I don't care about your protocols. I want to be alone. Whitmore recognized the warning signs. He had seen Adrian in difficult moods before, but something about today felt different. The prince's posture was more aggressive. His breathing was shallow and rapid, and there was a wild look in his eyes that suggested he was beyond rational discussion. Still, the guard knew he couldn't simply abandon his post. The security rules existed for good reason, and violating them could cost him his job and potentially put the royal family at risk. Your Highness, Whitmore said carefully, I'm required to stay with you for everyone's safety. Perhaps we could find a compromise that would give you the space you need while still following the necessary guidelines. The suggestion of a compromise was the final straw for Adrian. In his mind, compromises were something other people made, not princes. His face flushed red with rage as he stepped closer to the guard, close enough that Whitmore could smell the expensive cologne that couldn't quite mask the acrid scent of Adrian's mounting fury. I don't compromise with servants, Adrian hissed, his voice low and dangerous. You'll do as I say, or you'll face the consequences. Whitmore felt his own pulse quicken, not from fear, but from the recognition that the situation was escalating beyond normal bounds. He had dealt with difficult royals before, but none had ever spoken to him with such naked contempt. Still, he maintained his professional stance, hands clasped behind his back, eyes focused on a point just over Adrian's left shoulder. I understand you're upset, sir, he said, his voice steady despite the tension. But I can't abandon my post. If you'd like, we can call Commander Morrison to discuss alternative arrangements. The mention of Morrison's name, a reminder that Whitmore answered to someone other than Adrian, sent the prince into a blind rage. Without warning, Adrian's hands shot out and connected hard with Whitmore's chest, sending the guard stumbling backward into a decorative stone planter. The impact was forceful enough to knock the wind out of Whitmore and send him crashing to the ground among the carefully tended autumn flowers. For a moment, time seemed suspended. Adrian stood over the fallen guard, his chest heaving with exertion and rage, while Whitmore struggled to regain his breath and his footing. The sound of the impact echoed off the palace walls, and several gardeners who had been working nearby froze in shock at what they had witnessed. In the space of a few seconds, a minor disagreement about security protocols had exploded into something far more serious. Whitmore slowly pushed himself up from the crushed flowers, his uniform dirty and torn, a small cut on his forehead, from where he had hit the stone edge of the planter. His first instinct was not anger but disbelief. In 8 years of service, nothing like this had ever happened to him. He looked up at Adrian, who seemed almost as shocked as everyone else by what he had just done. The prince's moment of satisfaction at asserting his dominance quickly gave way to a cold realization of what had just occurred. He had physically assaulted a member of his security detail in full view of palace staff. This wasn't just a breach of protocol or a moment of bad temper that could be smoothed over with a quiet apology. This was an incident that would have to be reported, investigated, and dealt with through official channels. As Whitmore got to his feet, his training kicked in. Despite what had just happened to him, his first concern was still the prince's safety. Your Highness, he said quietly, his voice slightly hoarse from the impact. We should return to the palace immediately. This incident will need to be reported to Commander Morrison. Adrian's face went pale as the full implications of his actions began to sink in. He opened his mouth to say something, perhaps an apology or an order for Whitmore to keep quiet. But no words came out. The damage was done, and there was no taking it back. Several palace staff members had witnessed the assault, and the rigid protocols that governed life in the royal household would ensure that the incident could not be covered up or ignored. The walk back to the palace was conducted in tense silence. Whitmore maintained his professional demeanor despite his disheveled appearance, while Adrian struggled with a mixture of shame, anger, and growing panic about what would happen next. The weight of his actions pressed down on him with each step, and for the first time in years he found himself genuinely afraid of the consequences he might face. As they approached the main entrance, other security personnel had already been alerted to the situation. Commander Morrison was waiting in the entrance hall, his expression grave and his military bearing even more pronounced than usual. When he saw Whitmore's condition and Adrian's haunted expression, he knew that they were dealing with something far more serious than the typical royal tantrum. The next few hours would set in motion a chain of events that would test the very foundations of the monarchy. What had begun as a simple security escort had become a crisis that would force the royal family to confront uncomfortable truths about power, privilege, and the price of protecting their reputation at any cost. The shockwaves from Adrian's moment of uncontrolled rage would spread far beyond the palace walls, challenging everything the public thought they knew about the family they had been raised to respect and admire. In the immediate aftermath of the incident, as reports were filed and emergency meetings were called, no one could have predicted just how far-reaching the consequences would be. The assault on Guard Whitmore was just the beginning of a story that would ultimately expose decades of covered-up incidents, systemic abuse of palace staff, and a culture of entitlement that had been allowed to fester in the shadow of the crown. The Kingdom of Valdoria was about to learn that their beloved royal family harbored secrets that would shake their faith in the institution they had trusted for generations. Commander James Morrison had faced many challenges during his 2 decades of protecting the Ashworth royal family. He had coordinated security for state visits, managed threats from protesters, and dealt with countless minor scandals that never reached the public eye. However, as he sat in his office reviewing Guard Whitmore's incident report, he knew that this situation was unlike anything he had encountered before. The carefully typed pages in front of him detailed not just an assault, but a potential catastrophe that could undermine the entire security apparatus he had spent years building. Whitmore sat across from Morrison's desk, having been examined by the palace medical staff and cleared of any serious injuries beyond bruising and the small cut on his forehead. The guard's uniform had been cleaned and pressed, but he still carried himself more stiffly than usual, a visible reminder of what had transpired in the garden. Despite Morrison's urging, Whitmore had declined to seek outside medical attention, understanding instinctively that involving external doctors would only complicate an already delicate situation. "Tell me again exactly what happened," Morrison said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who hoped that somehow the details might change with repetition. He had known Whitmore since the guard first joined the palace security team, and he trusted the man's judgment implicitly. If Whitmore said Prince Adrian had attacked him without provocation, then that was exactly what had happened. Whitmore recounted the incident with the same precise detail he had provided in his written report. His voice remained steady and professional, but Morrison could see the lingering shock in the guard's eyes. This wasn't just about the physical assault, though that was serious enough. It was about the fundamental breach of trust and respect that governed the relationship between the royal family and their staff. For generations, palace workers had served with the understanding that while they might face demanding employers and difficult working conditions, they would never be subjected to violence. "Sir," Whitmore said after finishing his account, "I need to know how the palace intends to handle this. I have a family to think about, and I can't pretend this didn't happen. If I'm expected to continue working with Prince Adrian without any acknowledgement of what occurred, I'll have to consider my options." Morrison understood the guard's position completely. Whitmore was a good man with an exemplary service record, and losing him would be a significant blow to the security team. More importantly, if he decided to go public with his story, the resulting scandal could be devastating. Palace staff members rarely spoke to the media, but when they did, the public tended to believe them over official royal statements. "I understand your concerns, Thomas," Morrison replied, using the guard's first name to emphasize the personal nature of their conversation. "This matter will be handled through proper channels. Prince Adrian's actions were unacceptable, and there will be consequences. I need you to give me some time to work through the appropriate responses." As Whitmore left his office, Morrison immediately placed a secure call to Sir Richard Pemberton, the Queen's private secretary, and one of the most powerful figures in the palace hierarchy. Pemberton, a career civil servant who had managed royal crises for 15 years, listened to Morrison's report in grim silence. When the security chief finished speaking, there was a long pause before Pemberton responded. "How many staff members witnessed the incident?" Pemberton asked, his mind already working through the potential damage control scenarios. "At least 4, Morrison replied. 3 gardeners and a maintenance worker. They all saw Prince Adrian push Whitmore into the planter."
"And Whitmore's current state of mind?" "Professional but shaken."
"He's indicated that he expects the matter to be taken seriously. If we try to brush this under the carpet, I think we'll lose him and possibly face larger problems." Pemberton absorbed this information while calculating the political and public relations implications. The royal family's approval ratings had been steadily declining over the past year.
largely due to Prince Adrian's increasingly erratic public behavior and several minor scandals involving other family members.
A physical assault on a staff member would be catastrophic if it became public knowledge. "I'll speak with the Queen immediately," Pemberton said. "In the meantime, ensure that all witnesses understand the sensitive nature of this matter. We need to control the narrative before it controls us." Queen Isabella received the news in her private study, surrounded by the portraits of her ancestors who had navigated their own crises and scandals throughout the centuries. At 68, she had hoped that the most turbulent years of her reign were behind her, but her youngest son continued to present challenges that tested her skills as both a monarch and a mother. As Pemberton detailed the morning's events, Isabella felt a familiar mixture of disappointment and protective instinct. "Where is Adrian now?" she asked, her voice betraying none of the turmoil she felt inside. "In his quarters, Your Majesty. He's requested that Princess Catherine be allowed to join him, but given the circumstances, we thought it best to consult with you first." Isabella considered this carefully. Catherine had proven to be a stabilizing influence on Adrian in the past, but she also represented another potential security risk if she decided that protecting her husband was less important than protecting herself. The young princess had her own family and future to consider, and forcing her to choose between loyalty to Adrian and her own well-being could create additional complications.
Let her see him, the Queen decided.
But make it clear that this conversation is to remain strictly private until we determine our course of action. Meanwhile, in his private apartment, Prince Adrian was experiencing the full weight of his actions for the first time. The initial rush of anger that had driven him to push Whitmore had faded completely, replaced by a growing sense of panic about what his assault on the guard might mean for his position in the royal family and his future role in the monarchy. He had spent the hours since the incident pacing his rooms, alternately furious at what he saw as Whitmore's insubordination and terrified of the consequences he now faced. When Princess Catherine arrived, she found her husband in a state she had never seen before. Adrian had always been confident to the point of arrogance, secure in his position, and convinced of his own importance. Now he looked vulnerable and genuinely frightened, qualities that seemed alien to his personality. Catherine, 26 years old and the daughter of a prominent political family, understood the gravity of the situation immediately. "Adrian, what exactly happened?" she asked, settling into one of the antique chairs that furnished their private sitting room. She had heard rumors and partial accounts from various palace staff, but she needed to understand the full scope of the crisis they were facing. Adrian's account of the incident was defensive and self-serving, portraying his actions as a justified response to Whitmore's disrespect and insubordination. He emphasized his position as a prince and his right to privacy, while minimizing the physical nature of his assault on the guard. Catherine listened without interruption, recognizing the narrative he was constructing to justify his behavior to himself as much as to her. "Do you understand what you've done?" Catherine asked when he finished. Her voice was calm but carried an edge of steel that Adrian rarely heard from his normally supportive wife. "You've potentially destroyed everything we've built together. Our reputation, our future, our children's inheritance, all of it is now at risk. Because you couldn't control your temper for 5 minutes." The mention of their future children hit Adrian harder than any criticism of his personal conduct. He and Catherine had been planning to start a family within the next year, and the prospect of their children growing up under the shadow of his disgrace was devastating to contemplate. For the first time since the incident, Adrian began to grasp the true scope of what he had lost in his moment of uncontrolled rage. While the royal family grappled with the immediate crisis, the broader palace machinery was already working to contain the damage. Sir Richard Pemberton had convened an emergency meeting of the senior staff, including the press secretary, legal counsel, and heads of various palace departments. The group understood that they were facing a potential disaster that could destabilize the monarchy if not handled with extreme care. "Our primary objective must be protecting the institution while dealing fairly with the guard who was assaulted," Pemberton began, addressing the assembled officials in the palace's secure conference room. "We cannot allow this incident to define Prince Adrian's character or damage the royal family's standing with the public." The palace press secretary Margaret Thornton had already begun fielding inquiries from reporters who had heard rumors about an incident involving Prince Adrian. The palace's relationship with the media was always delicate, requiring a careful balance between transparency and privacy, but this situation demanded particular finesse. If the story broke before they could control the narrative, it would dominate news cycles for weeks and potentially trigger investigations into other aspects of Adrian's behavior. "We have perhaps 48 hours before this becomes impossible to contain," Thornton warned. "If any of the witnesses decide to talk to the press, or if Whitmore goes public, we'll be in full crisis mode. We need a strategy that acknowledges the seriousness of the incident while minimizing the damage to the royal family's reputation." The palace legal team, led by Sir Jonathan Hayes, was already working through the complex implications of the assault. While Prince Adrian technically enjoyed certain legal immunities as a member of the royal family, the assault on a palace employee created precedents that had never been tested in modern times. More importantly, the political ramifications could be far more damaging than any legal consequences. The guard could pursue criminal charges if he chooses. Hayes explained to the assembled officials. While the Crown Prosecution Service would be reluctant to proceed against a member of the royal family, they might feel compelled to act if the case became public knowledge. We're also looking at potential civil liability and employment law issues that could set dangerous precedents for how palace staff are protected. As the day wore on, the crisis management team worked feverishly to develop a response strategy that could satisfy all the competing interests at play. They needed to protect Prince Adrian from the worst consequences of his actions while ensuring that Guard Whitmore felt his concerns were being taken seriously. They also had to consider the broader implications for palace staff morale and the public's perception of how the royal family treated their employees. The challenge was complicated by the fact that this wasn't an isolated incident. Palace insiders were well aware of Prince Adrian's history of difficult behavior, and several senior staff members had quietly documented previous incidents that, while less dramatic than the assault on Whitmore, demonstrated a pattern of abusive conduct. If the current crisis prompted a broader investigation into Adrian's treatment of palace employees, the resulting revelations could be devastating. By evening, a tentative plan had emerged.
Prince Adrian would be required to issue a formal apology to Guard Whitmore and undergo anger management counseling. Whitmore would receive a significant financial settlement and assurances about his continued employment and career advancement within the palace security structure.
Most importantly, both parties would sign comprehensive non-disclosure agreements that would prevent them from discussing the incident publicly. The plan represented a typical palace solution: throw enough money and legal restrictions at the problem to make it disappear while implementing just enough reform to claim that lessons had been learned. It was a strategy that had worked countless times before when dealing with royal scandals and staff complaints. However, this situation would prove to be different from anything they had faced previously. As Queen Isabella prepared for bed that evening, she reflected on the long day and the difficult decisions that lay ahead. She had built her reign on the principle that the monarchy must evolve and adapt to remain relevant in modern times, but she had always assumed that evolution would be gradual and controlled. Prince Adrian's assault on Guard Whitmore represented the kind of crisis that could force rapid and unpredictable changes to the institution she had dedicated her life to preserving. The Queen understood that the next few days would be crucial in determining whether the royal family could weather this storm with their reputation intact. She also knew that whatever solution they implemented would set precedents that would affect how the monarchy operated for generations to come. The assault in the garden had lasted only seconds, but its consequences would reverberate through the palace halls for years to come. Unknown to the palace crisis management team, their carefully crafted plan was already beginning to unravel. Word of the incident had reached several prominent journalists who specialized in royal coverage, and at least one of the Gardner witnesses had been approached by a tabloid reporter offering substantial payment for his account of what had transpired. The 48-hour window that Press Secretary Margaret Thornton had predicted was rapidly closing, and the royal family was about to discover that some crises cannot be managed through traditional palace channels. The stage was set for a confrontation between the ancient traditions of royal privilege and the modern expectations of accountability and transparency. Prince Adrian's moment of rage had unleashed forces that would ultimately challenge the very foundations of the monarchy and force the British people to confront uncomfortable questions about the family they had been raised to revere. The palace's attempts to control the narrative would soon be overwhelmed by a tide of public outrage that would transform a simple assault into a constitutional crisis threatening the future of the crown itself. The carefully constructed palace strategy began to crumble at exactly 6:47 a.m. on a Wednesday morning when investigative journalist Sarah Mitchell received a phone call that would change everything. Mitchell, a seasoned reporter with 15 years of experience covering the royal family for the London Herald, had built her reputation on exposing the gap between the monarchy's public image and private reality. Her source, speaking in hushed tones from a phone booth outside the palace grounds, provided details about Prince Adrian's assault on Guard Whitmore that matched exactly with rumors she had been tracking for the past 36 hours. The prince attacked him without warning. The source whispered, clearly nervous about the conversation, pushed him right into the stone planter in front of everyone. The guard could have been seriously hurt, and now they're trying to cover it all up with money and legal agreements. Mitchell had suspected that something significant had occurred at the palace when her usual contacts began avoiding her calls and palace press releases became unusually sparse.
The confirmation that Prince Adrian had physically assaulted a member of his security detail was exactly the kind of story that could define her career. More importantly, it was the kind of story that needed to be told, regardless of the palace's desire to keep it quiet. As Mitchell began making calls to verify the information and gather additional sources, the palace crisis management team was conducting their morning briefing, unaware that their window for controlling the narrative had already closed. Sir Richard Pemberton reviewed the proposed settlement with Guard Whitmore, while Press Secretary Margaret Thornton outlined the media strategy they would implement if the story somehow became public.
We'll emphasize Prince Adrian's commitment to anger management counseling and his genuine remorse for the incident, Thornton explained to the assembled officials. The narrative will be one of personal growth and learning from mistakes, rather than criminal assault or abuse of power. The palace's confidence in their ability to manage the crisis was shattered when Thornton's assistant burst into the conference room with news that Sarah Mitchell had submitted a formal request for comment about Prince Adrian's alleged physical assault on palace security personnel. The request included specific details about the incident that could only have come from someone who had witnessed it firsthand or spoken directly with witnesses. How much does she know? Pemberton demanded, his usual composure cracking for the first time since the crisis began. Everything, the assistant replied grimly. Location, time, witnesses, the guard's injuries, even details about Prince Adrian's state of mind before the incident. She's giving us until 2 p.m. to provide a response before she publishes.
The next few hours represented a frantic effort by the palace to prevent the story from reaching the public.
Pemberton personally called the editor of the London Herald, attempting to persuade him that publishing the story would damage national security and undermine public confidence in vital institutions. Palace lawyers threatened legal action if the newspaper proceeded without allowing more time for the royal family to respond. Senior government officials were contacted to apply political pressure on the media organization. None of these efforts succeeded. The London Herald's editor James Weatherby had dealt with royal pressure campaigns before and understood that the story was too significant to suppress. The assault on a palace employee by a member of the royal family represented a clear matter of public interest that outweighed any concerns about embarrassing the monarchy. More importantly, Weatherby recognized that if his newspaper didn't publish the story, another outlet would, and he refused to be scooped on such a significant development. At exactly 2 p.m., as promised, the London Herald published Sarah Mitchell's explosive investigation under the headline Prince's Rage, Royal Assaults Palace Guard in Shocking Attack. The story provided a detailed account of the incident, including quotes from anonymous witnesses and confirmation that Guard Whitmore had been injured in the assault. Most damaging to the royal family, the article revealed that the palace had been attempting to cover up the incident through financial settlements and legal agreements designed to prevent public disclosure. The reaction was immediate and devastating. Within hours, the story had been picked up by news organizations around the world, with television stations interrupting regular programming to report on the scandal. Social media exploded with outrage and disbelief as people struggled to process the news that Prince Adrian had physically attacked a member of his own security detail. The #RoyalAssault began trending globally within 3 hours of the story's publication. Prince Adrian, who had been hoping that the crisis management team could make the problem disappear, found himself at the center of a media firestorm unlike anything he had ever experienced. Television news programs were running continuous coverage of the scandal, with royal experts and legal analysts debating the implications of his actions. Protesters began gathering outside the palace gates, demanding answers and accountability from the royal family. The public's reaction was particularly intense because it challenged fundamental assumptions about the character of the monarchy. For generations, the Ashworth royal family had cultivated an image of dignity, service, and respect for all people regardless of their social status. The revelation that Prince Adrian had violently attacked a working-class security guard who was simply trying to do his job struck at the heart of these carefully maintained perceptions. Queen Isabella, watching the coverage from her private study, felt a profound sense of failure as both a mother and a monarch. She had spent 40 years building public trust in the royal family, carefully navigating political changes and social evolution to keep the monarchy relevant and respected. Prince Adrian's actions threatened to undo decades of careful work in a matter of hours. The Queen's immediate response was to call an emergency meeting of the Privy Council, the body of senior advisors who counseled the monarch during times of crisis. The discussion that followed was frank and sometimes brutal, as longtime supporters of the monarchy expressed their shock and disappointment at Prince Adrian's behavior and the palace's initial response to it. "Your Majesty," said Lord Chancellor William Hartwell, a man who had served the crown for 30 years, "we're facing a crisis of legitimacy that goes far beyond a single incident.
The public is questioning whether the royal family believes themselves to be above the law and common decency. If we don't respond decisively, this could permanently damage the institution. The palace's initial attempts to respond to the media coverage only made the situation worse. The first official statement, released 6 hours after the London Herald story broke, was a brief acknowledgement that an incident occurred between Prince Adrian and a staff member, and that the matter was being handled through appropriate internal channels. The statement's obvious attempt to minimize the seriousness of the assault infuriated the public and the media, who demanded full transparency and accountability. Television commentators tore apart the palace's response with unprecedented viciousness. Royal correspondent Victoria Ashford, who had covered the monarchy for 2 decades and generally maintained respectful coverage, delivered a scathing analysis on the evening news that reflected the broader shift in public opinion. "This isn't just about Prince Adrian losing his temper," Ashford told millions of viewers. "This is about a system that believes violence against working people can be swept under the carpet with money and legal intimidation." The palace's response shows a fundamental disconnect from the values they claim to represent. The story's impact extended far beyond traditional media outlets. Social media platforms became forums for intense debate about privilege, accountability, and the future of the monarchy. Videos went viral showing ordinary citizens expressing their outrage at Prince Adrian's behavior, with many calling for his removal from the line of succession or even the abolition of the monarchy entirely. Guard Thomas Whitmore found himself at the center of a media storm he had never anticipated or desired. Despite the palace's efforts to keep his identity confidential, investigative reporters quickly identified him and began camping outside his modest home in South London. Whitmore's neighbors rallied around him, creating a protective barrier against the media intrusion, but the stress of constant attention took a significant toll on his family. In a carefully worded statement released through a legal advocate, Whitmore confirmed the basic facts of the assault while expressing his continued loyalty to the crown and his desire to return to his duties. However, his statement also included a subtle but powerful criticism of the palace's initial response, noting his hope that all members of the royal family would be held to the same standards of conduct expected of any citizen. Princess Catherine faced her own crisis as the scandal engulfed her husband. As a member of a prominent political family, she understood better than most how quickly public opinion could shift and how difficult it was to recover from scandals involving violence or abuse of power. Friends and family members began quietly suggesting that she considered distancing herself from Adrian to protect her own future and that of any children they might have. The international reaction was equally damaging to the royal family's reputation. Foreign media outlets, particularly in countries with historical grievances against the British monarchy, seized on the story as evidence of the institution's fundamental corruption and irrelevance. Republican movements in Commonwealth countries used the scandal to renew their calls for independence from the British crown, arguing that the incident demonstrated the monarchy's unfitness to serve as head of state. Perhaps most damaging of all were the stories that began emerging from current and former palace employees emboldened by the coverage of Prince Adrian's assault. Anonymous sources began sharing accounts of other incidents involving the prince's abusive behavior, painting a picture of systematic mistreatment of staff that had been covered up for years. While these accounts couldn't be independently verified, their consistency and detail lent them credibility that made them impossible for the palace to dismiss. The revelation that Prince Adrian's assault on Guard Whitmore was not an isolated incident but part of a pattern of behavior fundamentally changed the nature of the crisis. What had initially seemed like a single moment of lost temper was revealed to be evidence of deeper character flaws that raised serious questions about Adrian's fitness for any role in the monarchy. Opposition politicians who had previously been reluctant to criticize the royal family directly began calling for parliamentary investigations and formal inquiries into the palace's treatment of its employees. The scandal had given them political cover to challenge an institution that had traditionally been considered above partisan criticism. By the end of the first week following the story's publication, polling data showed that public approval of the royal family had dropped to historic lows. More troubling for the palace, the decline in support was particularly pronounced among younger demographics who would determine the monarchy's long-term viability. The traditional deference that had protected the royal family from sustained criticism was evaporating in real time. Queen Isabella realized that half measures and damage control tactics would not be sufficient to address the crisis. The public was demanding accountability and fundamental change, and anything less would likely result in permanent damage to the institution she had dedicated her life to preserving. The assault in the palace garden had become a catalyst for broader questions about power, privilege, and justice that could not be answered through traditional royal channels. The palace crisis management team found themselves facing a completely new reality, where their standard playbook of denial, deflection, and delay was not only ineffective, but actively counterproductive. The old methods of controlling royal narratives had been overwhelmed by the speed and reach of modern media, and the public's demand for transparency and accountability.
As the first week of the crisis drew to a close, it was clear that Prince Adrian's moment of rage had unleashed forces that would fundamentally transform the monarchy. The question was no longer whether the royal family could weather this particular storm, but whether they could adapt quickly enough to meet the public's evolving expectations of how power should be exercised in a democratic society. The worst was yet to come, as investigators and journalists began digging deeper into the palace's history of covering up problematic behavior by royal family members. What they would discover would make Prince Adrian's assault on Guard Whitmore seem like just the beginning of a much larger and more disturbing story. The call for a formal parliamentary inquiry into the Prince Adrian scandal came from an unexpected source. Margaret Fairweather, a Conservative member of Parliament who had previously been one of the monarchy's most stalwart defenders, rose in the House of Commons 2 weeks after the story broke to demand unprecedented government intervention into royal affairs. Fairweather's constituency, which included several thousand palace employees and their families, had been inundated with calls from voters demanding action and accountability.
Mr. Speaker, Fairweather declared to a packed chamber, "We cannot allow any institution, no matter how venerable or traditional, to operate above the law. The systematic abuse of palace workers that has been revealed demands immediate investigation and reform. The government has a duty to protect working people from violence and intimidation, whether their employer is a corner shop owner or a member of the royal family." The motion for inquiry passed by a margin that shocked even seasoned political observers. Conservative MPs who had never criticized the monarchy found themselves voting for measures that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. The Labour opposition, sensing a historic opportunity to challenge royal privilege, supported the motion unanimously while calling for even more aggressive measures. Prime Minister Robert Henderson found himself in an impossible position. As head of government, he had a constitutional duty to advise and support the monarch, but he also faced overwhelming public pressure to hold the royal family accountable for Prince Adrian's actions. Henderson had served as Prime Minister for 6 years and had developed a cordial working relationship with Queen Isabella, but he recognized that the political dynamics surrounding the scandal had made his usual diplomatic approach untenable. The parliamentary committee established to investigate the scandal was granted extraordinary powers that had never before been applied to the royal family. Committee members would have access to palace employment records, witness testimony from current and former staff, and the authority to compel testimony from royal family members themselves. The committee's chairman, Sir Oliver Pembroke, was a retired judge known for his meticulous approach to complex investigations and his complete immunity to political pressure. As news of the parliamentary inquiry spread, the palace found itself in completely uncharted territory. For centuries, the royal family had maintained that their internal affairs were private matters that should be handled through traditional channels of discretion and quiet resolution. The prospect of elected officials examining palace employment practices and questioning royal family members under oath represented a fundamental shift in the balance of power between the monarchy and democratic institutions. Queen Isabella's response to the parliamentary inquiry announcement was swift and unprecedented. Rather than fighting the investigation or claiming constitutional immunity, she issued a public statement expressing her full cooperation with the inquiry and her commitment to implementing whatever reforms were necessary to prevent future incidents. The statement was a calculated risk designed to demonstrate the monarchy's accountability while maintaining some control over the narrative. "The royal family exists to serve the people of this nation," the Queen's statement read, "and we must be held to the highest standards of conduct in all our interactions. I welcome this inquiry as an opportunity to demonstrate our commitment to the welfare of all who work in service to the Crown." The Queen's cooperative stance was driven partly by advice from constitutional experts who warned that resisting the inquiry could trigger a broader constitutional crisis that might threaten the monarchy's existence. More importantly, Isabella had come to understand that the scandal had revealed genuine problems in palace culture that needed to be addressed regardless of the political consequences. Prince Adrian's reaction to the parliamentary inquiry was far different from his mother's measured response. Confined to his quarters and barred from public appearances while the investigation proceeded, Adrian had become increasingly paranoid and isolated. His behavior during private meetings with palace officials became so erratic that concerns were raised about his mental health and fitness to continue in his royal duties. Princess Catherine found herself caught between loyalty to her husband and recognition that his actions had become indefensible. During a tense private meeting with Queen Isabella, Catherine made it clear that she was considering her options, including the possibility of separation or divorce, if Adrian continued to refuse accountability for his behavior. "Your Majesty," Catherine said during their difficult conversation, "I cannot continue to stand by someone who shows no remorse for hurting innocent people. Adrian seems to believe that this will all blow over.
and that he can return to his previous life unchanged. That's not acceptable to me, and it's not what the public will tolerate. The Queen understood that losing Catherine would be catastrophic for Adrian's future and for the monarchy's public image.
Catherine had been seen as a moderating influence on the prince, and her departure would signal that even those closest to him could no longer defend his behavior. Isabella found herself in the unprecedented position of essentially choosing between supporting her son and preserving the institution she had sworn to protect.
As the parliamentary committee began its work, a stream of former palace employees came forward with accounts of Prince Adrian's behavior that painted an even darker picture than had previously emerged. The committee heard testimony from housekeepers who described being screamed at for minor infractions, security guards who had been subjected to verbal abuse and threats, and administrative staff who had been forced to work in a climate of fear and intimidation. One particularly damaging piece of testimony came from Maria Santos, a former housekeeper who had worked in the palace for 12 years before requesting a transfer to avoid further contact with Prince Adrian. Santos testified that the prince had once thrown a crystal paperweight at her because his breakfast had been served 2 minutes late, missing her head by inches and shattering against the wall behind her.
"I loved my job and I respected the royal family," Santos told the committee through tears. "But I was afraid to come to work because I never knew what would set him off. The supervisors told us to just avoid him when he was in one of his moods, but sometimes that was impossible."
The committee also heard from Dr. Rebecca Walsh, a palace physician who had treated several staff members for injuries that she suspected were related to encounters with Prince Adrian. Dr. Walsh testified that she had been pressured by palace officials not to document the circumstances of certain injuries and had been told that discussing staff members' medical issues with anyone outside the palace medical team could result in her dismissal. Perhaps most devastating was the testimony of former palace security coordinator James Mitchell, who revealed that a special protocol had been developed for managing Prince Adrian's interactions with staff. The protocol, which had never been disclosed publicly, included measures such as ensuring that breakable objects were removed from rooms before the prince's arrival and requiring that staff members work in pairs when interacting with him to provide witness protection. "We essentially treated Prince Adrian as a security risk to our own people," Mitchell testified. The protocol existed to protect palace workers from the prince, not to protect the prince from external threats. That should tell you everything you need to know about his character and fitness for public service. The revelation of the special protocol sent shockwaves through the political establishment and the public. It provided concrete evidence that palace officials had been aware of Prince Adrian's violent tendencies for years and had chosen to manage the problem through cover-ups rather than address the underlying behavior. The protocol's existence also raised questions about the liability of senior palace officials who had allowed the dangerous situation to continue. As the inquiry proceedings were broadcast live on television and streamed online, public opinion shifted even further against the royal family. The testimony of palace workers, delivered with obvious sincerity and emotion, created a powerful contrast with the privileged lifestyle and sense of entitlement that Prince Adrian represented. For many viewers, the hearings became a symbol of broader inequalities in British society and the need for fundamental reform of traditional power structures. The inquiry's impact extended beyond Prince Adrian to other members of the royal family. Committee investigators began examining whether other royals had exhibited similar patterns of behavior, and whether the palace's culture of secrecy and privilege had enabled widespread abuse of staff members. While no evidence emerged of violence by other royal family members, the investigation revealed a broader pattern of disrespectful treatment and demands for inappropriate personal services that went far beyond normal employer-employee relationships. Queen Isabella found herself testifying before the committee, marking the first time in British history that a reigning monarch had been questioned under oath by elected officials. Her appearance was carefully choreographed to demonstrate both accountability and dignity, but the symbolism of the Queen being held to account by representatives of the people was profound and irreversible. During her testimony, Queen Isabella acknowledged systemic failures in palace management and accepted responsibility for allowing a culture to develop where staff members were not adequately protected from abuse. Her statement was carefully calibrated to express remorse, without admitting legal liability, but its impact was nonetheless significant. "I have failed in my duty to ensure that all who work in service to the crown are treated with the dignity and respect they deserve," the Queen testified. "These failures are ultimately my responsibility, and I am committed to implementing whatever changes are necessary to prevent such incidents from occurring again." The Queen's testimony marked a turning point in the inquiry and in public perception of the monarchy. For the first time in living memory, the royal family was being held to the same standards of accountability that applied to any other employer or public institution.
The traditional mystique and deference that had protected the monarchy from scrutiny was evaporating in real time. Prince Edward, the heir apparent who had previously maintained a careful distance from his brother's problems, found himself forced to take a public position on the scandal. In a carefully worded statement, Edward expressed his profound disappointment in Prince Adrian's behavior and his support for the parliamentary inquiry. The statement was seen as an attempt to protect his own future as king by distancing himself from his brother's actions. The fracture within the royal family became even more apparent when Princess Catherine announced her separation from Prince Adrian midway through the parliamentary hearings. Her statement, released through her own legal representatives rather than palace channels, cited irreconcilable differences regarding fundamental values and conduct, and made clear that she would not be returning to royal duties while married to Adrian. Catherine's departure was devastating for Prince Adrian, both personally and politically. It eliminated his last source of public sympathy and made clear that even those who knew him best found his behavior unacceptable. The separation also raised questions about the future of his position in the line of succession and his ability to continue representing the monarchy in any capacity. As the parliamentary inquiry entered its final phase, committee members began drafting recommendations that would fundamentally transform how the monarchy operated. The proposed reforms included independent oversight of palace employment practices, mandatory training for all royal family members on appropriate workplace conduct, and the establishment of anonymous reporting systems for palace staff to raise concerns about mistreatment. The inquiry's final report would prove to be just the beginning of a transformation that would reshape the British monarchy for generations to come. Prince Adrian's assault on Guard Whitmore had triggered a cascade of revelations and reforms that went far beyond what anyone had initially anticipated. The ancient institution of the monarchy was being forced to adapt to modern expectations of accountability, transparency, and respect for human dignity. The question that remained was whether the royal family could implement the necessary changes quickly enough to maintain public support, or whether the scandal would ultimately prove to be the catalyst for the monarchy's dissolution. As the inquiry moved toward its conclusion, it was clear that the British people's relationship with their royal family had been permanently altered, and there was no returning to the days of unquestioned deference and blind loyalty that had characterized previous generations. The parliamentary committee's final report, released on a cold February morning 6 months after Prince Adrian's assault on Guard Whitmore, contained 247 pages of findings that would fundamentally reshape the British monarchy. Sir Oliver Pembroke, the committee chairman, had warned that the report would be comprehensive and unflinching in its assessment of palace culture, but even seasoned political observers were shocked by the breadth and severity of the committee's conclusions. The report's central finding was that Prince Adrian's violent behavior was not an aberration but rather the inevitable product of a royal system that had systematically insulated family members from accountability while granting them virtually unlimited power over palace staff. The committee identified what it termed a culture of impunity that had allowed abusive behavior to flourish unchecked for generations, protected by traditions of secrecy and deference that were fundamentally incompatible with modern standards of workplace safety and human dignity. The evidence presented to this committee, the report stated, demonstrates that Prince Adrian's assault on Guard Whitmore represents merely the most visible manifestation of systemic failures that have endangered the welfare of palace employees for decades. The royal family's claim to moral authority and public support cannot be sustained unless fundamental reforms are implemented immediately and comprehensively. The report's 47 specific recommendations read like a blueprint for revolutionizing the monarchy. They included the establishment of an independent palace employment standards authority with the power to investigate complaints and impose sanctions, mandatory annual training for all royal family members on appropriate workplace conduct, and the creation of anonymous reporting systems that would allow staff to raise concerns without fear of retaliation. Perhaps most significantly, the committee recommended that all members of the royal family be subject to the same criminal and civil laws that applied to ordinary citizens, explicitly rejecting the traditional doctrine of sovereign immunity. The recommendation was accompanied by draft legislation that would make it clear that royal status provided no protection from prosecution for crimes including assault, harassment, and abuse of power. Queen Isabella's initial response to the report was carefully measured but represented a historic acceptance of external oversight that would have been unthinkable for previous monarchs. In a televised address to the nation, the Queen announced her acceptance of all 47 recommendations and her commitment to implementing them within 12 months, regardless of the personal cost to individual family members. The institution of the monarchy exists to serve the people of this nation, the Queen declared. And if that service requires fundamental changes to how we conduct ourselves and organize our affairs, then those changes will be made. The trust placed in us by the British people is sacred, and we will take whatever steps are necessary to honor that trust. The Queen's speech was widely praised for its humility and acknowledgement of systemic failures, but it also marked the end of the monarchy as it had existed for centuries.
The acceptance of external oversight and legal accountability represented a surrender of royal prerogatives that had been defended for generations, transforming the crown from an institution above the law into one subject to the same rules and standards that governed every other employer in the nation. For Prince Adrian, the report's publication marked the beginning of the end of his royal career. The committee had recommended his immediate removal from the line of succession and the suspension of all his royal duties pending a comprehensive psychological evaluation. More damaging still, the report suggested that his behavior might constitute criminal assault and recommended that the Crown Prosecution Service review the evidence with a view to filing charges. The psychological evaluation, conducted by a team of independent experts over several months, revealed the extent of Adrian's disconnection from reality and social norms. The evaluators concluded that he suffered from what they termed pathological entitlement syndrome, a condition characterized by an inability to recognize the rights and dignity of others and a belief that normal rules of conduct did not apply to him. Prince Adrian appears genuinely unable to comprehend why his behavior toward palace staff was inappropriate, the evaluation noted. His responses to questioning suggest a fundamental lack of empathy and a worldview that considers service workers to be essentially disposable resources rather than human beings deserving of respect and consideration. The evaluation recommended extensive therapy and psychological treatment, but also concluded that Adrian's prospects for meaningful rehabilitation were limited due to the depth of his personality disorders and his continued resistance to accepting responsibility for his actions. The findings effectively ended any possibility of his return to royal duties and raised serious questions about his fitness for any public role. Princess Catherine's decision to divorce Adrian and renounce her royal titles was finalized during this period, marking the complete collapse of what had once been seen as a stabilizing marriage.
Catherine's departure from royal life was accompanied by a memoir that provided additional insights into Adrian's private behavior and the palace's efforts to cover up his problems. I married a prince and discovered I was living with a predator. Catherine wrote in passages that dominated newspaper headlines for weeks. The palace's priority was always protecting the institution rather than protecting the people who served it, including me. I cannot and will not be complicit in enabling abusive behavior regardless of the titles or traditions involved.
Catherine's memoir became a bestseller and further eroded public support for the royal family, but it also established her as a credible advocate for reform who had personal experience with the system's failures. Her transformation from royal princess to outspoken critic of palace culture symbolized the broader shift in public attitudes toward the monarchy.
The implementation of the Parliamentary Committee's recommendations proved to be a massive undertaking that required changes to centuries-old protocols and procedures. The newly established Palace Employment Standards Authority began operations with a budget of £50 million and a staff of independent investigators, human resources specialists, and legal experts who had no previous connection to the royal family. The authority's first annual report, published 18 months after its establishment, revealed the scope of the problems that had been hidden within palace walls. The report documented 127 formal complaints from current and former palace employees, ranging from verbal abuse and threats to inappropriate demands for personal services and systematic wage theft. Most troubling, the investigation revealed that similar patterns of abusive behavior had been occurring for decades without any meaningful intervention by palace management. The evidence suggests that Prince Adrian's behavior was extreme but not unique, the authorities' report concluded. Multiple members of the royal family have demonstrated patterns of inappropriate conduct toward staff, suggesting that the problem was cultural rather than individual. The reforms implemented over the past year represent a necessary but insufficient response to systemic failures that will require sustained effort to fully address. Guard Thomas Whitmore, whose assault had triggered the entire crisis, became an unlikely symbol of the broader transformation. Rather than accepting the palace's initial offer of a financial settlement in silence, Whitmore had chosen to cooperate fully with the parliamentary inquiry and had provided crucial testimony about the climate of fear and intimidation that had characterized his work environment. Whitmore's courage in speaking out had cost him personally. He faced harassment from royal supporters who blamed him for triggering the crisis, and his family had been forced to relocate due to security concerns. However, his decision to prioritize truth over personal comfort had helped expose systemic abuses that might have continued indefinitely without his intervention. The Palace Employment Standards Authority offered Whitmore a position as a senior investigator, recognizing that his experience and credibility made him uniquely qualified to help implement the new oversight systems. His acceptance of the role was seen as a powerful symbol of how the reformed monarchy would operate, with former victims of abuse playing active roles in preventing future incidents. The broader transformation of the monarchy extended beyond employment practices to fundamental questions about the institution's role in modern British society. Public opinion polls consistently showed declining support for the royal family, with younger demographics expressing particular skepticism about the value and relevance of hereditary privilege. Republican movements that had previously existed on the margins of political discourse began gaining mainstream support and credibility.
Prince Edward, as heir apparent, found himself tasked with leading the monarchy's adaptation to these new realities. His approach was markedly different from the traditional royal strategy of maintaining distance and mystique.
Instead, Edward embraced transparency and accountability as core principles of his future reign, regularly appearing before parliamentary committees and submitting to questioning by journalists about royal finances, employment practices, and decision-making processes. The monarchy of the future must earn public support through service and conduct rather than demand it through tradition and deference. Edward declared in a speech that was seen as defining his vision for the crown.
We must prove our worth to each generation of British citizens rather than assuming that past achievements entitle us to continued privilege. The legal consequences for Prince Adrian finally materialized 2 years after his assault on Guard Whitmore. Despite intense political pressure and legal maneuvering by his representatives, the Crown Prosecution Service concluded that the evidence supported criminal charges of assault and workplace harassment.
Adrian's trial, conducted with unprecedented media coverage and public attention, resulted in a conviction and a suspended prison sentence that marked the first time in modern history that a member of the royal family had been held criminally accountable for their actions. The trial testimony revealed additional details about Adrian's behavior that had not emerged during the parliamentary inquiry, including evidence of financial abuse of staff members and systematic intimidation of potential witnesses. The conviction effectively ended any possibility of Adrian's rehabilitation or return to public life, cementing his transformation from prince to pariah. Queen Isabella's handling of the crisis and its aftermath was widely credited with saving the monarchy from potential abolition, but at enormous personal cost.
Her acceptance of external oversight and her willingness to sacrifice her son's position to preserve the institution's credibility required a strength and pragmatism that few had expected. However, the stress of managing the crisis took a significant toll on her health, and she began delegating increasing responsibilities to Prince Edward, in preparation for an earlier abdication than she had originally planned.
The reformed monarchy that emerged from the crisis bore little resemblance to the institution that had existed before Prince Adrian's moment of rage. The royal family now operated under constant scrutiny from independent oversight bodies, submitted to regular parliamentary questioning, and faced the same legal consequences for misconduct as any other citizens.
The mystique and deference that had historically protected the crown had been replaced by expectations of transparency and accountability that were enforced through formal mechanisms rather than traditional goodwill. Public opinion about the monarchy remained divided, but polling data suggested that the reforms had prevented the complete collapse of support that had seemed inevitable during the height of the scandal. Younger demographics remained skeptical, but there was growing appreciation for the royal family's willingness to accept meaningful change rather than fight to preserve indefensible privileges. The broader impact of the crisis extended far beyond the monarchy itself. The revelations about workplace abuse and cover-ups had triggered similar investigations into other powerful institutions, including prestigious private schools, elite social clubs, and major corporations. The principle that traditional privilege could no longer shield institutions from accountability had become firmly established in British political culture. Prince Adrian himself had become a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked privilege and the importance of holding powerful individuals accountable for their actions. His transformation from promising young royal to convicted criminal served as a powerful reminder that no one, regardless of birth or position, was above the law or immune from the consequences of abusing their power. The assault in the palace garden that had lasted only seconds had ultimately triggered the most fundamental transformation of the British monarchy in centuries. Guard Thomas Whitmore's decision to stand up to abuse had exposed systemic failures that might have continued indefinitely without his courage and sacrifice.
The resulting reforms had created a more accountable and transparent royal institution, but at the cost of traditions and privileges that had defined the crown for generations. As the dust settled on the crisis and the new systems became established, it was clear that Prince Adrian's moment of uncontrolled rage had changed British society in ways that would resonate for generations to come.
The monarchy had survived, but only by accepting that service to the people required genuine accountability to the people. The ancient institution had been forced to evolve or face extinction, and the reforms implemented in response to the scandal would serve as the foundation for whatever form of constitutional monarchy emerged in the decades to come.
Camilla's son shoves a guard. The royal family was stunned by the aftermath.